So Summer, she then symbolises as being a guest. So it's a guest that would be gone and thus without a wing goes away. So the Summer now symbolises the person who's died. So she's a guest because she can't stay anymore. She's going to be going again. She's not around forever. She's not a partner who's in a house. And then the guest, so Summer and the dead person, leaves without a wing and without the service of a keel, which links to water. And this again, like, so basically she doesn't sail away, she doesn't fly away, she just disappears like death into her light escape into the beautiful. So it ends on this really beautiful image of heaven and the person who's dying having this transcendent, very romantic experience going into heaven, but she who's left behind is still, you know, miserable. She's now in her twilight, the dusk is drawing in, and she feels like this harrowing grace. So she feels like being left isn't beautiful, it's harrowing experience. So she's pained because she's been left behind. I've also talked about twilight as well, this idea that you need time to get to the twilight point because the twilight had long begun. So summer doesn't quickly pass into autumn. This is why it's imperceptible. The twilight has taken a long time to begin and build up. And obviously human beings need that as well. We need time to get over our pain and to get to that point where we're willing to move on to the next stage. But this is very typical Dickinson. She very much sees nature as baffling and elusive. She doesn't sort of have a good grasp over it. And to me, in this, she doesn't seem to have a good grasp of her emotions either. But she at least, I feel like this poem is almost a way of her trying to express her confusion, or she's trying to make sense of what she feels by linking to the natural processes. But again, that's my interpretation. Very much believed that God was manifested in nature. Dickinson's did, and she was Puritan. She was very focused on natural landscapes, and she was quite interested in human emotions and transitions. So all of that is obviously present in this poem. In terms of the words, you've got quiet is described as a liquid because it's distilled. You've got twilight is described as an event because that reflects her movement into grief. You've got nature described as a woman. You've got dusk is presented as like a crowd coming together. Morning is reflective of light, and then summer is the guest who graciously leaves. So if you just kind of keep those key ideas in mind, and you kind of, maybe I would rewrite the poem using those sort of breakdowns of the symbols she uses, so you can kind of understand it a bit better. Like maybe rewrite each line in a way that describes what she means, and I think that might make it a bit clearer for you. Hi. Okay, moving on to A Wife in London. I'm so getting bored now. So this is linked to the Boer War, which is very similar to the time of the Charge of the Light Brigade, which is that sort of really patriotic poem that I taught you about, which is very similar to The Soldier. So again, at this time, society was still in the mindset of celebrating war, celebrating heroes. So what Hardy does is really good because he highlights, obviously, this negative aspect of war here. And there's a lot of typical Hardy language features here where he kind of really captures the environment that this woman is in and the dark and coldness of London. And he almost really builds it up like a really good story. Obviously, you've got these two sections of the tragedy and the irony. And that really sort of emphasises that this is happening all over his society, and that it's a massive suffering, and it's a massive irony that this all this love, all of this potential in the last stanza is snatched away from all these people because of war. So it's a massive protest poem. It's really good, and I think the irony makes the tragedy even more tragic. So it's not just that something's been lost, it's not just that the environment's cold and she's on her own, and that there's this horrible letter that's sent to her saying that her husband's because she's a wife, has been killed. It's also so much more tragic because of what they planned to do together. So life itself makes death worse. Like the better you live, the more tragic your death is. So there's a lot of bigger sort of spiritual idea here as well. And it's just such a sad poem. It's definitely, to me, the saddest poem in the anthology. This sort of loss of potential and loss of what they would have planned together. And in those days, you know, it wasn't common for people to remarry. And there's a sense of like lingering loneliness, which is reflected in the cold and the fog of the city itself. So it's not just her, it's the actual whole environment that she lives in is really tragic and cold and miserable and not a nice place to be. You got to remember this is the same London as Charles Dickens explains as well, so that kind of gives you a bigger contextual background for it. Anything that you'd say for Christmas Carol you can also use here. The euphemism fallen is quite important, because in those days it would be, sometimes you would die more from disease than you were in a battle. Like, more men died from disease at that time because diseases would quickly spread around the camp. So even that is kind of diminished as well, that you might not even died a hero's death. So again, Hardy definitely subverts traditional pre-1914 war poetry. Okay, there's very much a lack of static and abstract ideas besides love. So in terms of ideas and emotions, we're very much focused on love itself, which is obviously the biggest irony, because all that's left of her and him now is the love she still feels for him. So yeah, it's really sad.
Not bad.
Okay, Death of a Naturalist by Heaney is possible a reflection of the troubles he was having in his home in Ireland at the time. It's also a representation of the movement towards process of growing up. I'm not going to go into this in too much detail because I feel like we really went into a lot of detail in class, but just make sure you're focusing on the sort of deeper ideas behind the maturation of the frogs and that image, and also how the nature itself links to how the experience that the man goes through. This is typical Heaney, so that's one of your contextual points straight away. It's very, very good to link to autumn. There's loads of similarities there, and really good ideas you can look at in terms of how people's attitude is affected by their environment and the process of change itself. So I'm going to leave that there. Hawk roosting is very much possibly you could read as a criticism of communism and the idea that, which was very sort of being heavily debated at the time in 1960 when Ted Hughes wrote this, and the idea that communism eventually gives all the power to the state and nothing to the people. So even though the idea is that everyone is equal in society, actually what happens is the state ends up being separated and has all the power, and therefore that could be what the hawk is a representation of, because he has the world in his foot. We've also got possible references to dictatorships like Hitler. This wasn't too long after World War II. It's certainly still fresh in his mind how the impact of dictatorships and how I'm not actually sure if Hitler was technically a dictator, because he was part of a political party. Not sure. Maybe just be careful how you say that. But obviously the dictators across the world, there was just 1960s was very much sort of the start of sort of an ideological conflict between the West and the East, where the East was very sort of focused on communism and dictatorships, whereas the West was all about democracy and capitalism, where people could grow and move between segments of society. Personally, I think nowadays, because we are more critical of capitalism, you could argue that there are aspects of this poem that do apply to capitalism, that the people at the top do stop people from below from climbing higher by capping their wages at a low amount, while they keep a lot of profits for themselves, for example. So that's just one way. You can also read this poem as if the hawk is a psychopath. He's completely detached from society. He shows no remorse for what he does. I kill where I please. He also highlights the dangers of power. So it's very similar to Animal Farm by George Orwell, which was written around a similar time, maybe like 10, 20 years earlier, 15 years earlier, where really sort of exploring the power of man and what power does to man and how power can consume you. And that sort of confidence and bravado that he has. It's a really interesting poem to psychoanalyze, like to really psychoanalyze him and look at his motivations. He's clearly been a boastful tone throughout, and I think that, I mean, to me personally, this reminds me of the fat cats of our society, as we call them. So the people who own the massive corporations, who control so much they don't even pay their own taxes. But they have to do that to sustain their own power. So you get into this cycle. So again, this cyclical nature of power feeding power, and you go upwards at the expense of everybody else, which is one of the flaws of capitalism, that it suggests that everybody can get ahead if they just try hard, but actually there's only a certain amount of room at the top. Not everybody can be at the top, and in the poem it's the hawk who sits at the top, because he is the ultimate king of the birds. Okay, I'm not going to go through to autumn because we've done that loads. You've had loads of feedback on that from your mock. Afternoons, please make sure you look at your Larkin context sheet. There's so much. You've got the sort of towards the beginning of the second wave of feminism. You've got the social restrictions of the sort of domestic housewife with the man going out to work. You've got class restrictions where at this stage it was still very, very common, because we had private schools for working class people to end up in factories at the age of 14, and middle class people to be the ones who go on to university and become the academics, and the upper class people didn't have to do anything, they were just rich. So it was kind of, this was written on the cusp of where society was starting to change. And as we moved into the 1960s and the free loving and the breakdown of society and the rebellions against all those things, obviously people became a lot more free. Okay, so your afternoons, all your different social contextual ideas, also about sort of gender divisions in the home. The men do this, the women did this. The idea that you grow up and you get married, and there was no teenagers at this stage, so you didn't get to have that freedom. Larkin himself was unmarried, so he is an outsider looking in at the marriage, and just really is a symbolism of the sort of constraints of society at that time. Nowadays, we might take this for granted, because especially as women, we feel like we can grow up and be anything we want to be. We're not reliant to get married in order to be able to survive. To get a job as a woman at that time was only just becoming normality, so you would still sort of get married and not work. So everything was kind of wrapped up in the domestic life for the woman, and the man again was sort of just as trapped. He could go out to work, but he was, and maybe that's not necessarily a better thing than staying at home with children. They were still trapped in these skilled jobs, and I think the key thing there is stand. So they're very statically standing still. They're not allowed to move. They're not allowed to grow, and there's a complete lack of growth in the poem for the mums and the dads. It's the children who are growing and the children who are exploring and finding things and expecting things. And the key images that you really should be exploring is that the women's beauty has thickened. There's this idea that it's congealed, it's not fluid anymore, life's become rigid for them, and that something very vague is pushing them to the side of their own lives. It's a very cynical, typically Larkin poem, which really highlights the sort of misery of our life. This poem comes from The Whitsun Wedding, which is, for me, the most depressing set of poetry of all time, and it really makes you miserable when you finish reading it. And the poem does that as well. So something is pushing them to the side of their own lives. They're not in control anymore, and they're being sort of discarded. In the children are taking the central place. But again, you've got this idea of the cycle of life, which is why it links so nicely to autumn as well. And the process that women go through from lover to wife to mother, with the lover bit sort of referenced in stanza 2 with the wedding album, but not really part of their lives anymore. It's just a set of memories sat by the television. Very quickly, Ozymandias can be read from several points of view. On a basic level, it is about a man who meets another man who tells him about the statue of Ozymandias, which is really a broken down statue. There's only its legs left, and it was from an old pharaoh in Egypt, and his sort of whole empire has been destroyed, and all that's left of him are these words: "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair." So that's all that remains, including the legs. And symbolically, all of this symbolizes the power of time, the power of memory, the diminishing power of people's empires, I guess. That you build this big thing up during your lifetime, but maybe what's the point? How much do we preserve that? And then from sort of a literary point of view, the actual poem itself adds another layer of meaning to the poem, because the poem itself helps us to remember this Ozymandias. So the poem itself becomes part of his story. So you've got this sort of loop and this sort of cycle where time, or the story of him, is being remembered in different ways. The statue itself is a way of remembering him, and then from that, the poem is about the statue of the thing he has been remembered. So you've got these like stages of how we've remembered him, and Percy Shelley has from 1818, who's very traditional romantic, has sort of captured and sort of celebrated and elevated this as something that's worth remembering, which is really interesting. It is anti-romantic in tone, because it is quite sort of negative about the dismissive and like what's happened, and dismissive about what's left of him. But then, like I said, the poem itself celebrates it and helps to capture it. So there's just loads of layers of meaning in there which are very much band 5 if you can really get to grips with those.